Ukraine is facing pressure on its eastern front as Russian forces rapidly advance on the city of Pokrovsk. Authorities have begun what they call a forced evacuation of children and their parents. They say it's necessary with the city in range of Russia's heavy weapons. Residents are being warned they have 2 weeks at most to leave the city before Russian troops arrive, with more than 53,000 civilians remaining in Pokrovsk, which Ukraine uses as a military hub. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces now control more than 1,200 square kilometers in Russia's Kursk region, according to Ukraine's president. Russian officials say they have resettled more than 121,000 residents since the start of the incursion 2 weeks ago. CNN's Claire Sebastian has been following this. Claire, just talk to us first about how strategically important this city of Pokrovsk actually is.
Yeah, I mean, it's a small town. It's sort of similar size to Bakhmut, which, of course, the Russians took over last year. But it has been in Russia's sights, really, since they took Avdiivka back in February. It's about 60 or so kilometres west of that. And it is on a road intersection. It's been used by Ukraine as a military hub, essentially, to sort of house forces and equipment. And if the Russians were able to take it, then it would open up the road up to Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, other major military hubs in the east. So it would put the Donetsk region, which Russia still does not fully occupy, at serious risk. It's been a real target for Russia, really, as I said, ever since Avdiivka and even before that. And I think this is where you find the risk of the incursion into Kursk, right? On the one hand, the Ukrainians have been clear that they intend to try to distract Russian forces by bringing them from other areas, try to ease the pressure on the front lines, but they are also risking doing that to themselves, right? There were concerns around the eastern front when Russia opened a new front in the Kharkiv region back in May. Would this mean that the Ukrainians were still able to defend Pokrovsk and other towns effectively? I think the same questions are being asked now as the Russians are clearly making progress.
Yes, and the Ukrainian incursion is continuing apace, it seems. We've said 1,200 square kilometres now taken in the region. Have you seen then, given what you just said, any sort of change in strategy from the Ukrainians, given that, you know, they may have to deploy at this point?
Well, so obviously we can see from the numbers that the Ukrainians are putting out that the advance in the Kursk region has slowed, right? So last Thursday they said 1,150 square kilometres. Now, some 5 days later, it's just 100 square kilometres more than that. So obviously the first few days and the first week when they had that element of surprise were the most effective. I think what we see now, as well as attempts to advance, are consolidation. They've been pretty vocal. They want to create a buffer zone. They want to try to prevent the cross-border attacks back into Ukraine. And we continue to see those, right? There was an overnight assault involving missiles and drones. The Air Force saying some of those actually originating in Kursk. So that is a key aim. But we have heard from Zelensky on another really interesting part of this, sort of the public relations side of this incursion, and talking about why this is also about sending a message, in a sense, to the West. Take a listen.
We are now witnessing a significant ideological shift, namely the whole naive, illusory concept of so-called red lines regarding Russia, which dominated the assessment of the war by some partners, has crumbled these days somewhere near Sudzha. If partners removed all existing restrictions on the use of weapons on Russian territory, we would not need physical entry, particularly into the Kursk region, to protect our Ukrainian citizens in the border area and destroy Russia's potential for aggression.
So that is pretty stark, right? He's saying essentially that if the US and other Western allies had provided more long-range missiles and had lifted restrictions on using them inside Russia, they wouldn't have needed to go into Kursk with ground troops in the first place. He's also sort of arguing that the fact that they've now invaded Russia and we don't see anything out of the ordinary course of the hostilities and violence of this war in response, that it sort of makes a mockery of Western fears of escalation. Having said that, though, we don't see from the West, and in particular the US, UK and France, which have provided those long-range missiles, that they are yet ready to lift any kind of restrictions on using them inside Russia.
Yeah, interesting. Claire, thank you.